How excited are we? We're in chapter 20. Yep, we're almost there. So look, chapter 20 is going to be one of the most debated passages in the book of Revelation. So basically, you have these 10 verses right here, and really it's less than 10 verses because it's really only some in the middle that really have to do with the millennium, that are in a book that's so highly symbolic, but people argue over their exact meaning and exactly what the millennium means, and what's the time period and all of this stuff. I would just caution you right at the beginning against taking too dogmatic of a stand, right? So I can tell you, and it doesn't matter which view is mine or which one I lean toward, but I can tell you that I'm certainly not dogmatic about any view of the millennium, because again, it's just in this one little passage. Now, you can certainly take other passages and build an argument, based on what the millennium should be like. But as far as the actual description of the millennium or the use of the words millennium to describe it, this is the only place. And so to be dogmatic and to build a huge theology based on, what ultimately ends up being about 3 or 4 verses is a little dangerous. So we have to be very careful how we treat it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read the passage first, 1 through 10, and then talk about the general things, and then we'll go over the millennial views and all of that, okay? So at 21, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and the great chain. Notice that this is similar to the angel in 9:1 who had the keys and performed God's will. And in that case, in 9:1, the angel went down with the keys and opened up the pit and allowed demons and such to come out. Remember, we talked about that. That's where we talked about the Parthians, and there's this whole hodgepodge of different images, scary images. You've got the locusts from Joel, but also from Exodus. You've got the Parthians, you've got demons, and all this different things. And so again, that was to build up a big scary image of what's there being held back. And so those things are released back in chapter 9. Here, though, note that we have an angel who comes down to the bottomless pit and has a great chain, right? Note that this is dealing with the binding of Satan. But again, as I warned you last week about putting too much emphasis on Satan's powers, right? I think we often blame Satan for too much because we give Satan too much power, right? Again, Satan is not equal to God. It's not like we're watching a football game and, oh goodness, we just don't know who's going to win, right? It's not like that at all. As a matter of fact, that's the interesting thing here is note that God, it's not like God has to go down and bind Satan, right? It's he relegates that to an angel, right? He says, hey, go take care of this for me, right? So if it was a big deal, then, it would be a bigger deal, right? And it's just kind of an offhand, the angel goes down and binds Satan. So then at 22, and he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while, right? So note that the idea of binding evil angels and spirits is a common theme in first century Judaism. So in other words, in the time of Jesus and John and all of these guys, in the first century, this is a common theme that, again, is built and used again in the book of Revelation. So, for instance, and again, when we talk about common themes in Judaism in the time of Jesus, what do we look at? We look at extra-biblical literature. And again, my disclaimer, I always have to say this just in case somebody just happens to watch one video at one time. I always have to say my disclaimer just in case I get called a heretic or something. Again, these are not inspired books, right? When we talk about extra-biblical literature, it doesn't mean that they're inspired. It simply means, again, as I always say, that it gives us a snapshot of what people in Judaism believed in that time period, right? It would be, again, just like if you picked up a newspaper today, right? Let's say you're from 2,000 years from now, right? And you come back in time and you land right here and you don't know what day it is, and you open up the newspaper and bam, you could probably find out who the president is. You could find out what's going on in, with the collapse in Florida. You see all these things, and so it would give you a snapshot of the things that are going on in our time period right now. Same thing with books. You can read a book, and you could find that same stuff. If you go back and read Shakespeare, you pretty much know you're reading Shakespeare, right? You see Shakespeare and you're like, oh, and you get the language and you're like, oh, this is Shakespeare. Just because, again, you can, you have a feel for that. As a guitar player, I can hear a guitar player on the radio and I can just hear a guitar solo, and oftentimes I can tell you who that is because I know different styles of different people. So it's a snapshot, and it tells you what's going on in that time period and what they believe. And so again, and we've used this several times, what we call Enochian literature, or the books of Enoch, particularly First Enoch, is used, similar images are used throughout the book of Revelation. So we're talking about the binding of Satan or the evil spirits. So in 1 Enoch 10, 4 through 6, for instance, we get this. To Raphael he said, go, Raphael, and bind Aziel. And in Enoch, Aziel is the head of the demons, right? And so it's the Satan figure, right? Hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael, right? Throw him there, and lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones, and cover him with darkness, and let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. Cover up his face, and let him not see the light. And on the day of the great judgment, he will be led away to the burning conflagration, right? This is the same thing that we're talking about now, right? Again, that doesn't mean this is inspired. It just means it's the same basic idea, okay? And then you also get in another book that I don't think we have used in the past is a book called Jubilees. So whereas First Enoch is an expansion of Enoch, who was one of the only two people in the Old Testament who did not die, right? In the whole Bible, who did not die. He did not die, and the other one would be, of course, Elijah, who was taken up in God's throne chariot. And so Enoch, you have Enoch, and I think it's chapter 6 right there, and that whole section of Genesis, and you say, what is this deal about Enoch, and why didn't he die? Why did God just take him up, right? And so somebody in about the 2nd century BC said, you know what, I'd like to know that too, and so they wrote a book about it, and they wrote it First Enoch, right? And that's what it's about. Well, Jubilees is another retelling, it's the book of Jubilees, and it's a retelling also of the Genesis account, but it's a larger expansion of the whole Genesis account. And in Jubilees 5:6, it says this, against his angels whom he had sent to the earth, he was angry enough to uproot them from all their positions of authority. He told us to tie them up in the depths of the earth. Now they are tied within them and are alone. So again, it's a common theme in ancient Judaism that this whole idea of binding Satan or the head of the demons or the fallen angels, or in Enoch it's definitely the fallen angels. And so it's just a common theme. And so you have it here again in the book of Revelation. Again, because this is information that people in that day are familiar with, that's the way it's described, right? So back to Revelation 24. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Interestingly, this is a pretty long little verse here. And if you read it in Greek, it's extremely complicated, right? So it gives scholars, if you read different translations, it may be a little different or whatever. And so it gives scholars problems about exactly what's going on here, right? So one of the issues is, who are these thrones for, right? Who's seated on the thrones? It seems to be clear from particularly this translation, but if you look at it, it seems to be clear that since the saints basically come up next, those who died for Christianity, it's the saints who end up on the throne, right? Or these thrones. And so basically what you get here is you get a picture of the saints who are persecuted by the world, if you will, right? And so then in the end times, they get to be over the judgment of those same nations, right? So the world, they get to be in judgment of the world. And so the tables have turned, right? And so that's kind of the point there and what's going on. So note that it talks about the believers who came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, right? So these believers came to life. So they're either coming to life at the resurrection, at Christ's return, right? So that would be, and we hadn't talked about this yet, so it was a little unfair for me to put this in here, at premillennialism, right? Or they're raised to life in the intermediate state, right? Which is, and they're currently reigning with Christ right now, which would be amillennialism. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Note that the 1,000 years here, for these people who have been persecuted and who now get to judge the nations, and again, the nations basically means the world, right? Those who get to judge the nations, note that the time of tribulation was 3.5 years, right? So, and we talked about that back then, and we said that's a short time. 3.5 years is a short time, right? But they get to reign with Christ for 1,000 years in judgment over the nations, right? So you're only going to suffer for a short time, but you have basically an eternity, the super long period of time. That's the point. The time that you have to reign with Christ is way greater than the time that you're persecuted. So therefore, don't focus on the persecution that you have now. Focus on the eternity that you'll have to reign with Christ. That's the point going on there. And this is in fulfillment of Daniel 7:22. Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom, right? And so you kind of have a fulfillment there of that. So then at 25, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. So note that the rest of the dead who did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended, this seems to be those who are dead, but they are unbelievers, right? So those who did not put their faith in Christ and died, it would appear that the point here, without being dogmatic, I'm not telling you it's definitely the only way to read it, but it would appear that the point there is those who die in Christ go to be with Christ. Bless you. But those who die out of Christ seem to be in an intermediate state. Now, when I say an intermediate state, I don't mean purgatory, like in Catholicism. That's not what I mean. I mean they seem to be dead, right, in some way. And then at the final judgment, that's when they will be raised, and then they will be judged, and then they will be cast into the fire and all of that. That seems to be what's going on here. Note it's a parenthetical statement, right? So let's see if we can get the full. Okay, so it said, they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, back at 24. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Well, this is the first resurrection is referring to those who came to life, right? It's not referring to these people who were dead in the ground, or however you want to look at it, in the intermediate state, waiting to be, because what will happen is when they open their eyes, apparently, from the intermediate state, in other words, death, being dead, the unconscious, or however you want to look at that, when they open their eyes next, they will be at the final judgment. They will be judged negatively, and then they will die. Those who are judged positively, or those who die in Christ, they are with Christ right now. Again, that seems to be the point. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection, right? That's a good thing. Over such, the second death has no power. Second death means spiritual death, right? So you get the first death, and it may be a violent death for you, but you will not, if you die in Christ, you will not experience the second death, which is your spiritual death, right? Those who died outside of Christ, they will suffer the second death, that death being their spiritual death, right? Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And while the 1,000 years are, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, right? So then you have the release of Satan, and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth. Gog and Magog to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So what is this Gog and Magog? Oftentimes you will have people who will try to figure out who Gog and Magog are. They're clearly supposed to be representative of world powers, right? They originate in Ezekiel, Gog and Magog. And then in the intertestamental period, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, this period of time when you have Enoch written, and you have Jubilees written, and you have all this intertestamental period, you get this whole idea of Gog and Magog being representative of various different nations, right? And so it would seem that since Gog and Magog, by the time Revelation is written, has been used to describe several different nations, it would seem that they represent nations in general, evil nations, okay? So it's a general title, right? Gog and Magog, which again refers back to evil nations of the past. It's not necessary that you're looking for specific countries, like, was it the late great planet Earth, when it came out and everything? I think Gog and Magog were specifically Russia and different things. Again, there's no reason for us to believe that that's the case. And listen, let me just say this. Even if that is the case, the chances of you figuring out exactly what Gog and Magog are unlikely, right? So in other words, to get caught up on those little details is really not the point. The point is that evil nations will be destroyed, right? It's a simple point that we often, because we want to know every little detail, we overcomplicate it, right? And so it's not, again, necessary to try to figure out exactly what Gog and Magog are, because they're probably just symbolic of representations of evil nations in general, as they've been used to talk about other nations in the past. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. All right, so that seems, again, if you're waiting for a big battle where you get to fight and all that stuff, it's a little anticlimactic, because that's not what happens, right? And notice this isn't a big fight where it spends 3 chapters explaining. Think about the Old Testament. Think about the book of Joshua, where you get the conquest of the Canaanites, and you get all of these different battles where they're fighting these people, and these people defeat them, and then you take some idols, and then you're in trouble, and then you lose some battles, and then we win some battles, and then you're supposed to kill everybody, and you didn't, and so then you lose a battle, right? And it's all very, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? Well, none of that happens here, right? It's boom, Satan's thrown into the lake of fire. Well, that was easy, right? So again, we're not talking about two equal powers, right? Satan is a created being, just like every other created being. God created divine beings to do His will, however He chooses. He asks them whatever to do His will, and they do His will. Some of them obviously rebelled. Just like He created humans to do His will, and then humans rebelled, right? It's the same kind of thing. And sometimes people will say, well, I don't know, why would He create angels to do His will? And, He doesn't need angels to do it. Well, right, and He doesn't need humans to do His will either, but He still did it, and He still has humans do His will. And so that's just the way it is, right? For whatever reason, God chooses to have both angelic divine beings and humans help to do His will, right? Okay. And I probably should have done slides for you on this. So look, just remember that you can go back, and you can, if you need to, you can go back and look at the video. I will say there are a couple of books that you can look at, and maybe I'll go back and put them in the comment section that go over. I know Zondervan, and one of them's not Zondervan, but there is a Zondervan book that has it. It's like 4 views on whatever, 5 views on whatever. There's a 4 views on hell, and a new one on heaven just came out, and all this. And so what it does is that they pick 4 scholars or however many scholars that have each different view, and then they present their view, and then the other scholars will say why their view is wrong. And then the next scholar will present his view, and then the other 3 scholars will say why they think his view is wrong. And so what it does is it gives you kind of a crash course. They're usually about 200 pages each, and they give you a crash course on whatever that is, right? And so you can get everything from Adam and Eve to church, how the church should work, and women in ministry, and all these different things. And so again, if you're wanting to kind of get a crash course on some subject, look at those. They're called the Counterpoints books. And so again, you can go through and read those. It's pretty good because again, they're not going to go through every single detail, but they're helpful if you kind of want to know what are the views on this. Like, why do people believe what they believe? Well, then bam, you can read it. And once in a blue moon, you'll get somebody who doesn't really present the view very well, but again, it's good for a good dive in. But what I need you to understand about this, and I doubt many of you give that much thought to the millennium. I don't give that much thought to the millennium, as far as wanting to debate it or argue about it. But all four views that we're going to go over, good Christians have had all four of these views. Giants in church history have believed all four of these views in the past. So in other words, don't get too, it's not like we're talking about heretical views, right? These are all Christian views of the millennial kingdom. They can all four pick passages that they use to interpret, and they can do it well, right? And so again, to get too dogmatic about which view is definitely right or whatever, again, it kind of misses the point, right? It's nice to be able to get as close as we can, but when it comes down to it, you're not going to be able to argue definitively because it's just not meant for that. God doesn't spell out everything for you. It's kind of like we were talking about Job earlier, and part of the book of Job is, it tells you right at the beginning that Job is righteous, right? And so he's a righteous guy. And so at the end, when he wants to know, what does he want to know? He wants to know, why is all this stuff happening? Why is there injustice in the world and all these different things? And what does God say? He says, well, you just can't know. You can't know, right? You have to trust in God. Spoiler alert for those of you who study Job right now in Sunday school. Spoiler alert, it is the point is you can't know everything. You can't interpret it all. And you just have to trust in God, who is wisdom, right? And you have to trust in God's wisdom. And that's the point. That's the point of the book of Job. Again, spoiler alert for those of you who are doing it. And so that's kind of the thing here. You're not going to be able to definitively prove one view or the other. And so, again, you might have your favorite view. I have one, maybe two that I lean toward. But that's that. Okay, enough of that. Obviously, we're not going to argue about it. Okay, so I'm going to do them in order of when they came about, okay? When the views. Now listen, let me just say this. Just because ancient people, like people in the 1st century or the 2nd century or the 3rd century, believe something, again, normally you'd think, well, they're closer to the time period, so they're probably right. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? And so, all four of these views are, they have their pluses and minuses, but just because certain people believe them, I'm only telling you that in order to just let you know that there are good Christians who have it. It doesn't mean that it's right? It doesn't mean that it's right. So the first view is premillennialism. I'm going to go through all four and just tell you what they are, and then I'll explain them, just so you can kind of know what's coming. All right, so the first view is premillennialism. The second view is amillennialism. The third view is postmillennialism. And the fourth view is pre-tribulational premillennialism, right? So that's a lot of big words. So look, the millennium is the time that Christ reigns, right? Okay, and so the pre, post, all of that is just when Christ comes to earth or doesn't, based on his millennium. So if it's premillennial, he comes before he reigns for a millennium, right? If it's postmillennial, he comes after he's reigned for a millennium, right? And that's going to make a little more sense here in a minute. Okay, pre, post, pre-tribulational, pre, okay? All right, so what is premillennialism? Also known as historic premillennialism, okay? So we have lots of adherents that we've had in the past, right? So Irenaeus, Charles Spurgeon, right? John Piper, you've probably heard of. Al Mohler is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Wayne Grudem, you might have his systematic theology. Sometimes it's always in bookstores, and you get Wayne Grudem's systematic theology. And actually, my favorite Bible scholar, Ben Witherington III. I read Ben Witherington's book in maybe about 2005. It was called New Testament History, a Narrative Account. And it was that book that inspired me to study the Bible, right? Because it was so enlightening, and I thought, wait, I can understand some of this stuff. And so it made me want to study the Bible. So that was, I studied the Bible, and that was why I eventually went to seminary. And I had it autographed by Ben Witherington. Some people like sports people and rock stars, and I like Bible scholars. So that's exciting to me. All right. So the earliest adherents to premillennialism, right, are going to be from the first century to the second century. In other words, you have really early adherents to premillennialism. And how do we know that? Well, you read their writings, right? And they talk about it. They don't call it premillennialism like we do today. They talk about it and when Christ is going to reign, and you go through and you study that and you say, okay, well, clearly they believed he was going to reign before the millennium, right? So they are premillennial. So premillennialists believe that all of those on earth will go through the tribulation, right? So if there's a great tribulation that's an ultimate be-all, end-all tribulation of the church where the church is persecuted, everybody will go through it, right? In other words, whoever's living at that time of the tribulation, nobody gets a pass, right? They will go through the tribulation. Christ will then return after that tribulation period, right? And then he will reign on the earth for a 1,000 years. Now, that 1,000 years could be literal, or it may not be, right? It could just be a long period of time. So it could be less than 1,000 years. It could be longer than 1,000 years, right? But he comes before the millennial reign, reigns on earth for a millennium, whatever exactly that means. Satan is bound during that period of time, right? And then Satan is released at the end. There is final judgment of Satan and those who remain unfaithful. But because in premillennialism, you still have people who do not believe in Christ or do not follow him even during the millennial period, right? And so that's the point. That's what we call historic premillennialism, all right? Then you have amillennialism, right? So the early church leader Augustine, both Martin Luther and John Calvin were amillennialists. C.S. Lewis was an amillennialist, and R.C. Sproul is an amillennialist, or was an amillennialist. The earliest adherents to amillennialism are also into the second century, even though Augustine really made it popular in the let's say 300s and 400s, and then amillennialism was actually pretty much the interpretation of the church for a very long time. So amillennialists, so normally means not, right? It would mean no millennium, but that's not really what it means. Amillennialists believe that Christ is reigning right now in heaven with all of those who have died. This is the millennial reign. The entire time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming, that is the millennial reign, right? So then one of the things that people will say is they'll say, well, wait a minute, Satan is bound, right? It doesn't seem like Satan is bound because things are still going pretty badly, right? And so, and that is that's a possible thing. But what they will argue, amillennialists, is that Satan is bound in that in chapter 12, he's thrown down to earth. He no longer has access to heaven. And he can't stop the gospel from being spread across the earth. That's the way Satan is bound. So the binding of Satan is a symbolic way of saying that he no longer has the power of death over people because they now can have faith in Christ, right? And so he's still here doing stuff, but he is bound in the sense that he can't stop the spread of Christianity. Matter of fact, you could argue that when things go bad for Christians, what do? They cling to God even more, generally, and Christianity spreads even more. Christ will return at final judgment, and that's it. In other words, you have the millennial reign right now, and then Christ will return, and bam, that's it. When he comes, whoever's here, everybody's judged. Those who are dead will be resurrected. Everybody gets a new body. You get a new body, and you get a new body, right? And then that's it. That's that. That's amillennialism, okay? Postmillennialism. There are, one thing I did not say, most people today are premillennial or amillennial still, right? There are still people who are postmillennial, but it kind of petered out a little bit. Jonathan Edwards and B.B. Warfield are famous postmillennialists. The first earliest spelled out version of postmillennialism is from the 1600s, so it's relatively late as far as interpretation goes. Again, that doesn't make it wrong. It just means that it's spelled out, it's a little late. So the millennial reign. So Christ is reigning right now on the earth through the spreading of the gospel, right? At some point, the gospel will reach its climax, and then Christ will return. So note, he's reigning now, the millennium is happening now, and then he comes post-millennium, right? So again, it's spreading through the gospel. Satan could be bound now, depending on who you ask, in postmillennials, which would be similar to Amillennialism, or later, as premillennialists will argue. Christ will return at the climax of the spreading of the gospel, and then he will judge, and all of that will happen. One of the biggest problems with postmillennialism is that, first of all, it assumes that the earth will continue to get better and better and better. Right? And so a lot of people believe that until we have like World War I. And then when World War I hit, pretty much postmillennialism was like out, because it was like, well, clearly the earth's not getting better. We thought it was, but then World War I. And so World War I pretty much threw the whole, all the nations in topsy-turvy, and you think this is terrible and all this, and it was terrible, obviously. And so it seemed to kind of kick into that idea that the earth is continuously getting better and better. Because, again, in postmillennialism, basically it's our jobs to continue spreading the gospel, and then eventually we'll make the earth a place to where Jesus can return to. This is the reason that you have, so the Puritans, just for the record, were postmillennialists, right? And that's the reason that you have the forced, conversions of the Indians, and the Crusades and all of that, because again, they believed if they didn't force people to become Christians, then Jesus couldn't come back, right? Because Jesus needs us before he can come back, right? So again, there are very few postmillennialists today because of those reasons. And then last, and the one that many of you are probably more familiar with, but you probably don't know, I don't want to ask that, but yeah. In other words, many of you would associate with some aspects of pre-tribulational premillennialism without also hanging on to, say, dispensationalism. Like many of you, and I don't mean this bad, I didn't know what it was until I studied it a handful of years ago. Dispensationalism, most of you probably don't know what dispensationalism is, and it's pretty complicated. So pre-tribulational premillennialism, right? So you have John Nelson Darby, Schofield, Lewis Sperry Schaeffer, John Walvoord, Charles Ryrie, Hal Lindsey, and even today, so you have John MacArthur, which is a big, he's a big pre-tribulational premillennialist. The earliest pre-tribulational premillennialist positions are going to be furthered in the 1800s by John Nelson Darby. He was, I think, British, if I'm not mistaken, and he brought it over to the United States. So what do they believe? They believe that, many of you believe, that Christ will return, but he will return only to get the church. And depending on which version you have, so you have classical pre-tribulational premillennialism, but then you have modern day progressive, what's called progressive pre-tribulational premillennialism. And the change is basically who gets raptured up and how much overlap there is between the Jewish people and the Christian people. Because basically in dispensationalism, to make it as simple as possible, God's chosen people are the Jews, right? And that's obvious in the Old Testament. And then you get to Jesus, and then the Jewish people, they do not follow Jesus. And so God says, you know what? I'm done for now. I'm not dealing with you people. And so then he goes and he allows the Gentiles in, right? It's a pause. It's what dispensationalists will call a pause in the program, if you will. So after a period of time, Christ will return. He will take all believers, the church, up and rapture them away, right? So rapture is a term that you're familiar with. And then those who are unbelievers will stay on the earth, and they will go through the tribulation period. So there you have pre-tribulational, right? Means before the time of great tribulation, right? And depending on, again, whether you're historical or classical premillennialist or progressive, they will say that the point of the tribulation is so that Jewish people can come to faith, right? And so they have an opportunity to return back to Christ during that tribulation period, okay? Christ will return, oftentimes 7 years into the tribulation period, and then he will reign on earth for a millennium, right? And so that's where you have the two premillennialist positions together. So basically this one just adds the rapture idea, right? The idea of a rapture with the church being raptured out, then the tribulation, then Christ returns, and then you have the millennial reign. Whereas historic premillennialism is simply you have everybody going through the tribulation, and then Christ returns, and then he rules for 1,000 years, right? So that's the difference. Satan again. So at that point, it's very similar. So Satan is bound at that time, and then Satan will be released, and those remaining will be judged, right? And so those are your four millennial positions. And again, there are people who adhere to all of those four today, postmillennialists being the least. The other three, both historic premillennialism and pre-tribulational premillennialism, and then amillennialism, right? Those are going to be the three main positions that people follow today, all right? So there you go. And again, regardless of how you look at it or which position you take, what you need to take out of it is Jesus will return, he will judge evil, and he will reign, right? No matter how he does it. So he may reign regardless, even if you're an amillennialist, when Christ returns, he will still return and he'll judge, and then he will reign on this earth forever, right? And so that's the point. The new heavens and the new earth come together. And really in all of these positions, that's the ultimate goal, is that Christ will reign on the new heavens and the new earth, which they come together, and then Christ will return for eternity after judgment, right? So regardless of the four positions that you take, the ultimate end is the same, okay? And so to argue about it where people get pretty heated, I just don't get it. I don't. Many of you probably didn't know any of those positions, and you've been fine ever since. You've been good Christians without all of that information, right? And it hasn't changed you a bit. But we're doing Revelation 20, so we had to go through it. All right. Is that clear as mud? All right. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody want to ask a question about it? All right. Is anybody more confused than they were before? Honestly? Does anybody understand it better now than they did before? Okay. All right. I made it as simple as I could. So, and like I said, I'll put in the comments on the YouTube video, I'll put the book, and maybe I'll bring it next week. All right, so then at 2011, then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. Okay, so note that this whole idea of books is a similar idea to in Daniel 7:10. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Right? So you have a similar scene from Daniel 7. And again, if you'll remember way back when we did chapters 4 and 5, and I told you that there were, I want to say it was 14 exact points of similarity between Daniel 7 and Revelation 4 and 5. And so again, you have lots of references to Daniel, particularly Daniel 7, but other places as well. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. So it's interesting. Note that the rest of the dead, right? It seems to be those who did not come to life and were to be judged at the millennium, right? So this would be the rest of those dead who are now being judged. And it's interesting, this whole idea of, and this is one of those things we don't think about, and the sea gave up the dead who were in it, right? And death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, right? So what is this about the sea giving up the dead? Well, if you were a first century Jewish or Gentile person, then you believed that if you were not buried, then whatever the afterlife held, you couldn't get to it, right? And so those people who were killed in sunken ships and things like that, since they weren't buried, those people could not make it to the afterlife. And so the assurance here is that no matter how you died, you're still going to be judged. It doesn't matter if you are not buried or whatever happens. It kind of be like us today thinking, well, what happens if I'm cremated, right? I've actually met people who refuse to be cremated because they said, well, then I can't be resurrected. Well, guess what? Your body's going to turn to dust regardless of how you're buried, right? So that's kind of the whole point. Your body's going to turn to dust. And if God wants to resurrect your body, then he's going to do it, no matter how. I mean, he is God, so. All right. So then at 14, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire, right? So this is spiritual death. Once you're thrown in the lake of fire, it's done and over with. You have no more opportunities to not experience the second death. You're in it. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire, right? So again, I just want to clarify, all that stuff's complicated, and the millennial, and let me just say, it took me years and years and years to read over and over and over, and all these different things about the millennial views, and it seems easy enough, pre-millennial, post-millennial, right, all millennial. It seems easy enough because it tells you right in the name what it means, but I was like, I have no idea. And I'd always have to go back and look at it, right? And so it's just, doing it again, it brings it into your mind. So if you find yourself saying, I have no idea what he's talking about, well, welcome to the club, because I've been there, done that. And anybody that tells you that they just know everything about it and they're just, that hasn't studied it forever and ever and ever, then make them explain it to you in a way that you can understand it. And then tell me. The point of all of this, again, is that one day Christ will return in judgment. The saints will sit with Christ in judgment over the nations who persecuted them, right? I.e. the world. And that's the point. All of the little details and all of the stuff that we argue about. And listen, I want to know. I want to know as close as possible what all this stuff means. I think you get it, that I've tried, right, to understand as much as possible so that I can get it to you and everything. And I find this book fascinating. Strangely enough, Genesis 1 through 11 and Revelation, those are my two favorite books. And I don't know why, but there's things in there that I like to study. And I think it's important that you understand the Bible as much as you can. But when you get to stuff like this, again, it's very complicated, and we're trying to look at it 2,000 years removed from the original time period, the original author, and we're trying to make sense of it, right? And so certainly we have opportunities to provide context from extra-biblical literature, but when it comes down to it, to say, I definitively understand this position to be correct, and there's no way that any other way is correct, that's just not fair. It's not a fair way to look at information that's so dense. But when it comes down to it, you don't have to. Because again, the overall point is the same no matter what. And so there's no reason to argue about it because you're going to end up in the same place ultimately, right? And so, is it interesting to study? Absolutely. I find it fascinating. But is it required for your salvation or anything like that? If anybody tries to make your millennial view, if it's one of these particularly, and say that it has to do with your salvation and you're going to go to heaven or not go to heaven or whatever, based on your view of the millennium, stop talking to that person. All right, that person is no good. Okay, because that's crazy talk. All right, because again, we read through many of the Christians who believed each of those positions, and there are giants of Christianity in each one of those positions. So those people were clearly Christians and brought many people to God, and to say that they weren't Christians because of their view on the millennium. It's like people who say that if you weren't brought to Jesus based on the right Bible translation in English of all places, then you can't be a Christian, right? Well, again, if anybody ever tells you that, that person is not somebody that you need to talk to anymore. All right. All right, very good. Very good. All right, let me just say, the next two chapters, it won't get any more complicated than this. The next two chapters will be fairly simple. And I'll look at it. It's possible, I don't know, we might be able to get two chapters in one week, but I doubt it. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.